All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to keep talking about form, but this time we're going to focus on the concept of a phrase. The previous video, which if you haven't watched that one yet, please go ahead and watch part one. That talks about like introduction to the concept and just like larger definition things, but also discusses the idea of motives as the smallest musical idea. Um, Today we're going to talk about form as that idea that it is the smallest musical idea that ends with a cadence, right? So if a motive is our smallest analyzable musical idea, the phrase is the smallest musical idea that ends in a cadence. In the previous video, sort of talked about the colloquial aspect to this, where you can think of phrases sort of like, that thing that you intuitively do in music, right? We phrase things. You play through music and take a breath at like a pause. Well, that pause is almost always a cadence, or often is a cadence, maybe, especially in classic Western music or folk music, pop music. That's usually how it's structured. It's often like a musical thought. We could refer to it to that as that. We often talk about it as like a musical sentence, though in the previous video I kind of went into a long tangent about how that's a great like way to wrap your head around what a phrase is. However, we're going to have a specific type of phrase called a musical sentence. So you just want to make sure those two things are like differentiated in your mind so you don't get confused. And that they're goal oriented, right? And that's again just sort of a parallel to Western literature and thought, traditional sort of structure to how we structure our thought and storytelling, and also music. That we're moving towards release. We're going from a moment of repose through tension to a moment of release of that tension. Obviously, that is not the case with all music, especially when you get into late 19th century and then 20th century, 21st century music. It can do tons of different things, but as we're studying just generalizations, classic music, romantics, pop, folk, all that kind of stuff, you're going to see this sort of pattern, and that's what we're working on today, is to not only like wrap our heads around what that looks and sounds like, but how do we represent that? So how do we show someone what we are hearing, and to enable to do that, right, we have to be able to graph. Really quickly, I want to remind you of the concept I said in the last video. This idea that music and general conversation has this sort of pattern of question and answer, and that we'll refer to in music as this antecedent and consequent structure. That there is music that's inherently questioning, that it moves towards a moment and leaves the listener wanting more, and those are often what we've been analyzing as half cadences. And then there is music that answers that, and provides closure, and that usually ends with an authentic cadence. That thing, the combination of those two things, is the combination of a number of phrases and motives and cadences. It's something that we're going to study in the next section of these lectures, called a period. And it's in itself then, probably representative of a very simple formal structure as a whole. It's important to keep that in mind, though, because we're going to see this pattern coming up over and over again. And I want you to at least be conscious of it, aware of this sort of antecedent consequent hierarchy that we're going to have in our music, or often have in our music. Okay, so one of the purposes of music theory, in general, aside from the thing I don't think we talk about enough, but it's a music study where you slow down, and that is critically important, right? You spend most of your time as a musician listening to music or performing music, and that's intuitive. You intuitively listen, and you can begin to critically listen by using theoretical and oral skills and all that sort of stuff. But music theory, the actual act of participating in that intellectual process, is a moment in time where you can stop music and really critically analyze it, to think about it slowly, to apply sort of academic rigor and analysis. Just in itself, man, that is such an important thing to do in life and in music and in study. And that's a large part of what you get from a theory curriculum. The other part of that, obviously, is that we're trying to develop a language where you can talk eloquently about what you're hearing. And you've been doing that for a while with harmony, with chords, and studying diatonicism, right? You write major chord and you say that's a C major chord. because it literally is, but it's also what you're saying is, oh, that's a major chord because I hear a major chord. In the key of C, that's a one chord because I hear a one chord, I hear tonic, right? And to make that connection for you to be able to, through the analysis, talk to someone, but also through your analysis to be able to look down on it and hear the music and to analyze the music you're conducting for your high school choir or orchestra or you're composing, and then to have that as a guide, right? A map, a representation. It's so important. It's incredibly useful. In this section of the class now, we're just talking about how do we build that same understanding and representation of music, but now with structure, right? In form. And the first thing we're going to look at here is how do we graph phrases? How do we show phrase structure? And this is totally new, okay? There's some parallels, as we're going to see, to what you've done maybe in previous study of literature or poetry and stuff like that. But it doesn't borrow from our harmonic analysis because it's a totally different paradigm, right? We're talking about form and not harmony. We're talking about music through time, not music vertically as a harmonic event. So when we're graphing and we're doing analysis of phrases and formal structures, we're going to use the same symbology as diagrams in literature. So if you remember back to ever studying like a Shakespeare sonnet or something like that, you had like the A, B sort of thing, right? And these were showing relationships, right? That this A rhymed with that A and that rhymed with that B, right? If this is totally Greek to you, then I don't know, go look it up. It's really interesting how we sort of structure rhyming schemes in poetry and stuff like that. We're going to borrow on that really heavily when we talk about how to analyze phrases and formal structures. Just as an aside, we will also talk about analyzing motives. Really important to know, though, when we talk about phrase and like form, we're going to start with letters from the beginning of the alphabet. So you'll see me using like lowercase a, lowercase b, lowercase c. And then eventually when we start talking about periods and larger structures, it'll be capital A, capital B, capital C. When we're talking about motives, we start from the back of the alphabet. And this is really just to keep your music that you're analyzing clearer. Because if you had a bunch of motives that were also labeled ABC and a bunch of phrases that were labeled ABC, it could look really confusing really quickly. So we'll call motives like motive X, motive Y, motive Z, etc. We'll talk about that more later when we talk about motivic analysis in sequences and stuff like that. But just as an aside, in case that comes up and I forget to say it, that's what we'll be doing. Okay, so phrases. Using the same symbology as analyzing diagram or having your diagrams that we use to analyze poetry and literature, stuff like that. Phrases will be used. We'll be analyzing phrases to be able to show, sort of that structure. We'll be using lowercase letters for phrases. And we'll start with A. The first phrase that you hear in a piece of music that you're analyzing, you'll always call A. The second phrase you'll always call B. The third phrase you call C. The differentiation here is this. This is where it gets really interesting and where the grayness and sort of subjectivity can kind of come in. It's like subjective and it's a little objective. It's really one of the more interesting parts about analyzing music, that you get this sort of crossover sort of way of thinking. That the first phrase of your piece you're going to call A, and then there'll be a pause, and we'll look at this in just a moment. You could then have another phrase that's called B, or you could have another phrase that we're going to call A prime, and the prime is this little tick mark. It looks like a 1 there. That's a phrase that starts the same as A, but is not A. Okay, so it's a phrase that sounds like it's a repeated version of the beginning, but it's not. It's slightly different. And that may sound really abstract, but it's incredibly common to have A and then A prime. Okay, to demonstrate, it sounds like this. You've heard this like a ton, right, in music. So say a little piece of music, and I am making this up as we go along, so this probably won't be great art, but just keep that in mind. Say a little tune goes like this. Pause. Hey, that's a cadence. cadence. It sounded like it repeated itself, but it did not, right? The second one ended differently. That as a structure, oops, that as a structure would be this. That's A and A prime. That's incredibly common, right? Because we like having music that repeats itself. In fact, our music is very repetitive usually, especially melodically. There's a lot of repetition with text and rhythm and all this stuff. But we don't like it to just like be the same thing over and over again, right? That would be really boring. That's that concept. It's super common, and it's like an abstract thing to wrap your head around until you realize it is like what you want to hear. Okay, so I mentioned the word graph. That is what we're going to be doing primarily, like on homework and things like that. You're going to be practicing making these graphs to show exactly what you need to show to get across what you're trying to or what you're actually hearing. So when I say, hey, when I say like provide a phrase analysis or a phrase graph, this right here is what I want you to make. And this is, I say here, the minimum of what we're going to have. We're going to eventually add to this and start to telescope out and have all these different layers and stuff. It's going to be very interesting. We'll have modulations in there. But what this is we're showing the key of the piece. So in this case, this piece is in the key of E flat major. We are showing measure 1, that this starts in measure 1, and there is a half cadence in measure 4. Therefore, right, that is an idea that ends with a cadence, which means this is a phrase, and in this case, it's phrase A, because it's the first phrase in the piece, right? We're calling this measure 1. There's a half cadence, and then the music keeps going. We'll measure 5, and we're listening to the music, and we're listening, and we're waiting for a pause, a moment of repose. We're waiting for a cadence. There's a cadence in measure 8. I wrote AC here. This is just authentic cadence because I was just making it up, but maybe this was an IAC or a PAC or whatever. That is showing that that's the final pause, right? And that this did not end exactly the same as that, right? So this is A prime. That's a phrase graph. And again, is the smallest representation of what we're going to be doing in the class. And eventually, we'll start to look at how do we like group these? Like, what is this? What comes next, and how does this over here relate to that? And that's when we start talking about larger period things and binaries and ternaries and all this kind of fun, interesting stuff that's coming up later. Yeah, so that's what you're going to be doing on your homework when you say, hey, do a phrase analysis of this. This is what I want to see. What's important to note is I'll probably also ask you to do a harmonic analysis. Okay, so you're going to be doing both. Because you can't really do a phrase analysis without doing a harmonic analysis, right? See, you have to know where the cadences are. And in order to know where the cadences are, you can identify it orally. And I hope you're starting to be able to do that. You can hear pauses in music and, you know, where you would phrase it and all that sort of thing. But you also have to be able to zoom in and say, okay, well, what's that chord? What type of cadence is that? Why is it that type of cadence? Why was that a half cadence? Oh, we're in this key. That was a 5/7, and that's where the pause was. That is a half cadence. Does it make sense? So it's not an abandoning of like all the harmonic stuff we have been doing. It's merely like using those harmonic skills in order to prove or to show something else in music. Cool. Let's listen to some music. So this is Der Lindenbaum. It's a beautiful piece. I'll pull it up here. A beautiful, beautiful piece. And what I want you to listen to, well, first, before we listen, I've numbered this. And these are just the measure numbers. We're going to do a phrase analysis, but we're going to start right here, just because we're going to start where the gentleman starts to sing, where the text comes in. You could do a phrase analysis where you incorporate all this introductory piano stuff, and that would be totally fine. It would be totally different, right? Because this music would be heard and spoken about in contrast to the music that came before it. We're just going to start here at measure 9. So we're going to listen. What I want you to do while we're listening is don't try to focus too much on the harmony. Try to let the music hit you like a normal human being would. Just kind of, you know, what do you feel? What's the general affect of it, right? If you understand the German, like what are they talking about? All that good stuff, right? But also, I want you to think, as you're listening, where are the phrases? Okay. And that's me saying, like, objectively to you, where do you hear pause? Like, where is a moment of repose? If you were teaching this to someone, where would you tell them to breathe? If you were singing this, where would you breathe? Right? Those are all like colloquial kind of ways to think about where the cadence is, where the phrase is. And that's what we want to show in our graph. Okay, so let's take a listen. Here we go. Here's measure 3.
Am Brunnen vor dem Tore, da steht ein Lindenbaum. Ich träumt in seinem Schatten so manchen süßen Traum. Ich
And it keeps going, right? Eventually, we can listen to this piece and analyze it all the way up to here. And I think you guys can actually probably analyze all this chromatic harmony at this point too. So we can look at not just measures 9 to 16, but all the way to this double bar here. And that's where we're going, where we're heading with this whole discussion, right? Okay, so hopefully you were following along and watching. I put a little breath mark here because that's where I felt a pause. And I think probably you felt it there too. There's a tendency for students to want to feel a breath there, but this is not through the complete idea yet. That I don't think your teacher would tell you to breathe there. Maybe they would. But I think they would probably tell you to like push through all the way to der Lindenbaum, right to there, and kind of like then have that moment of release. And then you go back so, me, do, right? And kind of repeat the music. If that's the case, that means measures 9 through measures 12 is our first phrase, which we call A. So let's show that. Let's show that up here. So measure 9, I'm going to draw my little phrase graph up here. Measures 9 through measure 12 was A. What's the key for this piece? Gotta zoom back. Looks like 4 sharps. It was pretty happy sounding. You have an E, a B, and a G sharp. Looks like E major. You'd be right if you said E major. Oops. We're in the key of E. Measures 9 to measure 12 were an idea that we're calling A. What was the cadence then? We need to also have that here. What was the cadence at measure 12? So you have to zoom in, right? We're in the key of E. And we're looking to where the pause was. This was the pause. That's the cadence. What's the harmony? We're in the key of E. That is a B, a D sharp, and an F sharp, right? There's a B down here too. So B, D sharp, F sharp. A, sure, passing tone. B, D sharp, F sharp, A. 5/7, right? And then E, low G sharp, if you're a clarinet player, looks pretty good. B, E, E, G sharp, B. 1. What's your cadence that's 5/7 to 1? That's an authentic cadence, right? What type of authentic cadence is this? Is this an imperfect or perfect authentic cadence? Remember this from way back in the day, right? It's coming back. Here we are. This is the application of it, right? This is 5/7 to 1, and it's moving root position 5/7 to root position 1, and the top voice, the soprano voice, is going re, do. That is a PAC. It's a perfect authentic cadence, right? So then up here, we write PAC. And then the piece continues. It measures 13, 14, 15, and 16. This was the other moment of repose, the other pause, the other cadence, right? We zoom in and think, okay, cool, that was the cadence. Well, this music looks very similar, right? In fact, this music is literally the same thing. That is 5/7 to 1 is a PAC. It's like literally the same music, right? Which means we go back up here and we think, cool. That was 13, it was measure 16. There's a PAC. This is A. It's literally the same thing. It's 9 through 12 is A, PAC. 13 to 16, A, PAC. This is what we're going to call a period when we look at that in our next lecture. And it's a period that is a repeated phrase. And I know we just talked about this over here, the A and the A prime. This is way more common. Like, this is way more common than literally just repeating itself. But this one's a great one to look at for a first example because it's hopefully very clear that it's like an idea, statement, pause. An idea, statement, pause. 2 phrases. Those 2 phrases are literally the same. They start the same, right? They look and sound the same. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about motives, right? They look and start the same, and they end the same. They're both in E. That's our graph right here. And this is what you're going to start doing for your homework. Again, this idea of graphing this 8 bars here, and then we'll look at the next 8 bars, and we'll look at those 2 groups of 8 bars together, so that one 16-bar thing is a thing that we'll be able to label. And I think you can see where we're going with this, right? The next 16 bars is 2 groups of 8 things that are another larger thing. And then those 2 larger things put together are another thing. And it's this really interesting kind of like telescoping. So you have this, and you have this, and you have this, and you have these things down here, and you make this big triangle of like analysis. I found it really fascinating because then you can step back and look at this whole thing here, right? And think, cool, what is that? That as a whole is this thing. But if you zoom all the way in and look at these elements, that going back to the idea of bark on a tree, you can see, some sort of relationship, some sort of idea that pops out, and how all of it is kind of tightly woven and interrelated. That's the concept. That's the phrase analysis concept. Okay, you're going to do a very simple one of these on your homework. Think about the process. It's not like, it shouldn't be shocking as like a analytical academic process. So think about like what this means to have that, what it means to have that, why you got to that answer, like really procedurally go through it. And then as it gets more complicated, as we start to put more variables into it, it'll become much more interesting, right? So imagine like you're all the way back to analysis level of when we were talking about like 1 to 5 and 5 to 1. If you remember back to doing that, it was like your homework was like literally the same thing over and over again. It was resolve 1 to 5, now resolve 5 to 1. And they're all in root position, and all of your answers look the same because there's only one possibility. Well, eventually this here will transform into, these sort of, hey, let's write a little SATB counterpoint where we're going to have, 5, 6, 5 of 5 to 5 to 5 of 6 to 6 to 1 to 2 to 5 to 1 or something. And we'll have passing tones and suspensions, and everyone's are going to look different. That's more or less where we're going to head. Your analyses are going to have some variance in them and like personalization. And there's going to be, things to kind of tweak and be subjective about to get to that point, right? To get to that point, we need to be careful and understanding and critical about how we understand this, and that this is feeling very strong. Okay. So yeah, just let me know if you have questions. Do, like I said, like a lot more of this on homework. And just reach out if any of it's unclear or you want to go through anything else one more time.